Hello everyone. I welcome you all as I take you on this journey to discover one of the greatest poets of 18th century British literature, Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope was born in the year 1688 to an affluent Roman Catholic family. The year 1688 is also a very crucial year in the history of Britain because it was the year of the Glorious Revolution. It was the year when William of Orange and Queen Mary ascended the throne after the death of King James II, also known as James VII. Pope's father was a cloth merchant, or as he was called in those days, a linen draper, who retired from business the year Alexander Pope was born. Now, why did Pope's father retire the year his son was born? This move was perhaps because of the fact that William and Mary, that is the monarchs who had ascended the throne in 1688, were Protestants, and a new act of parliament forbade Catholics from living within 10 miles of London. I've already told you that Pope was born to a Roman Catholic family, and because of this act, his family could not live in London. Because they could not live in London, his father had to give up the business that he had been pursuing all this while. After moving out of London, Pope was initially educated at home by a Catholic priest. Then he was enrolled at 2 different Catholic schools. But Pope was largely self-educated, which was in a way inevitable because the law of the time prohibited Catholics from attending university or from pursuing a career in either medicine or law or the clergy. This meant that none of these professions were open to Catholics, and because Pope was a Catholic, he could not pursue any of these professions, and this left hardly any alternatives for him. Pope was, however, a very precocious child, almost a child prodigy, as they would say. He taught himself Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and showed very interesting and very good poetic ability from a very young age. In 1700, the family moved to Binfield in Windsor Forest, further out of London, and it was here in 1705, when Pope was barely 7 years old, that Pope, who had been a healthy child so far, contracted a tubercular disease of the bones called Pott's disease. Now, for all of you who are wondering that tuberculosis ideally should only be in the lungs, I would like to tell you that tuberculosis as a disease can occur in any part of your body. So not just the lungs, it can be tuberculosis of the brain, and as it happened in Pott's case, it was tuberculosis of the bones. And at that time, when Pope contracted this disease, his doctor attributed it to Pope constantly bending over his books to study. Remember that he was a precocious child. But this disease, Pott's disease as it was called, recurring at regular intervals in his life, left Pope stunted and deformed. He became a hunchback who, at his tallest adult height, was no more than 4 feet 6 inches, and who was rendered so frail and so weak that he could not stand up without being supported by stays. He had to wear 4 pairs of stockings simply to keep his legs straight up. In his 20s, he made very frequent visits to London, making the acquaintance of the literati of London, most notably people such as Wycherley and Walsh. In 1709, he published his first work, the Pastorals. So one can imagine that in 1709, Pope would have barely been 11 years old, and he published at such a young age. In 1711, while yet a teenager, he met the Blount sisters, Teresa and Martha Blount. Both these sisters belonged to a family that were Pope's neighbors. He was infatuated with the more beautiful, more gregarious, more happy Teresa at first, but it was eventually the more sober Martha Blount with whom Pope formed a lifelong friendship. and to whom he bequeathed his property upon his death. Rumors abounded that Pope and Martha Blount had married in secret. But be that as it may, Pope and this lady called Martha Blount carried a beautiful and a very strong friendship throughout Pope's living years. Pope had many female friends and he admired them greatly, but he was too diminutive, too ugly looking, as he himself acknowledged, to ever be considered a prospective husband or even a lover. Let us take a look at Pope's literary career. His work, The Essay on Criticism, was published anonymously in 1711, and it was furiously attacked in print by John Dennis, who was a famous literary critic of the day, and he had been satirized by Pope in this poem, The Essay on Criticism. Dennis, upon reading the Essay on Criticism and realizing that he was the one who was being satirized, he retaliated by referring to Pope as, I quote, a hump-backed toad. But the Essay on Criticism brought Pope to the attention of great 18th century writers such as Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, John Gay, Thomas Parnell, Oxford, and Steele. And all of these great literary writers were members of the Martinus Scriberaris Club. They were all Tories, that is, royalists, and this club, called the Martinus Scriberaris Club, Pope joined as a member after becoming friends with its members and founders. This club, the Martinus Scriberaris Club, was a club which was consistent of a group of well-known writers of the day who took it upon themselves to ridicule pretentious erudition or scholarship and also literary jargon through the persona of a fictitious literary hack called Martinus Scriberaris. In 1712, at the suggestion of his friend John Carroll, Pope wrote and published the first version of his most famous poem till date, The Rape of the Lock, to reconcile two feuding but very prominent Catholic families. And the female member of one of these families, Arabella Fremore, was the heroine or the protagonist of The Rape of the Lock. Pope elaborated and expanded the scope of this poem in 1715, and this time he wrote it as a complete satire in the style of a mock epic on 18th century aristocratic society and on what he perceived were the follies, the foibles, the faults, and the idiosyncrasies of women. By now a successful author, Pope embarked between 1715 and 1725 on his verse translation of Homer's Iliad and of the Odyssey, both of which translations, written in collaboration with two other writers, William Broome and Elijah Fenton, would be the greatest literary labor of Pope's life, and which, published in 6 volumes over the years, won him not only great popularity but also a lot of money. Pope's father, who he really respected and revered, passed away in 1717, and this was the year that the first volume of Pope's collected works was published. Pope speaks with great affection and respect of his father in the poem that will be in your course, An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, but more on that later. Pope is the first author in the history of English literature to be able to sustain himself financially entirely on the profits derived from the publication of his own works. If you will look back at my previous lecture on the literary, social, and cultural characteristics of 18th century literature, you will remember that I also spoke about how this was the age when it became entirely possible to earn a living purely by writing. The difference being that before this, Most writers had to depend upon the patronage of rich men or of aristocrats in order to get their works not just published but even read. And in that situation, when we look at the works of Alexander Pope, we realize that this is one person who was actually able to make a living entirely out of his writing. He did not need to seek the patronage of the aristocrats of his day. And therefore, in 1718, with all the money that he had earned from his translation and the sale of the Iliad, he was able to lease the villa of Twickenham on the Thames near Richmond, which was a suburb of London, and he moved with his widowed mother, and he lived there for the rest of his life. It was a place where he entertained his numerous friends, and he kept making landscape additions to his estate. During his literary career, and in fact throughout his life, Pope feuded with numerous literary and political rivals. He hated people with a vengeance and surely was hated in turn. He turned his old friends into enemies because he was brutally frank and would not hesitate to criticize them or to ridicule them for what he perceived were their faults. He was both ungracious and unforgiving. And this is not really the picture that comes out from the poem that we will be studying in just a little while, an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. However, in real life, he indeed was very unforgiving. He turned some of his best friends into his enemies because if they would speak against him, he would not hesitate at all to retaliate. Pope's essay on criticism, which, as I told you earlier, was published anonymously in 1711, was furiously attacked in print by John Dennis, who was the recipient of his satire in the essay on criticism. So that was the first literary enemy that Pope made. In 1715, Pope met Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and she was one of the very well-known, one of the rare female writers, women writers of the 18th century. For some time, Pope was totally infatuated with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. They continued to be friends, but much later, in 1728, he would hold her up to malicious ridicule in his essay called Perry Bathhouse, published in his Miscellanies. This was a work on which he collaborated with the other great writer of the 18th century, Jonathan Swift. Pope's Dunciad, one of the works that is regarded as his magnum opus on satire. So this work, the Dunciad, had originated as a scheme of the Martinus Scribblerus Club, of which he had become a member earlier. In its earliest incarnation, Louis Theobald, a Shakespearean scholar who had feuded with Pope, he had the dubious honor of being the central character of the Dunciad. But in the last version of this work, the Dunciad, which was brought out in 1743, Louis Theobald was replaced by Colley Cibber, a bad poet who had nevertheless managed through his political connections to become the poet laureate of England, which meant that he was at the highest political level, highest government level of literature in England. So this was the second enemy that Pope made when he satirized Colley Cibber in his work, the Dunciad. Now, William Broome, who was a man of talent, and he had, as we have already noted, helped Pope to write his translation of Homer, the Odyssey. But Pope offended him too, not only in Perry Bathhouse, the essay in which he satirized Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. So Pope offended William Broome not just in this essay, but also in these lines which appear in the first version of the Dunciad. And I quote, "Hibernian politics, O Swift, thy doom, and Pope's translating 3 whole years with Broome." So the next enemy that Pope made in the literary world was his own ex-collaborator, William Broome. In his another poem called the Essay on Man, Pope had expressed very strong religious views which were vehemently attacked by the other writers. Pope remained a Tory or a royalist, a supporter of the monarchy all his life, and he attacked the Whigs both in their governance and in their ideologies. To remind you once again, the Tories were the royalists or the supporters of the king. The Whigs were the parliamentarians or the supporters of parliament and of democracy in England. Pope's health, which had never really been very good, had been rapidly failing, and he died in his estate at Twickenham in 1744, having lived not just a great life, but also a very eventful life. Let us look at some of the important works that Pope wrote and take you down on a chronological journey of those works. So as we discussed, his earliest published work was the Pastorals in 1709. His essay on criticism, in which he attacked John Dennis, came in 1711. His mock epic, Rape of the Lock, first appeared in 1712 in 2 cantos and was later on revised when it appeared in a pirated version by a publisher who did not take his permission. Pope revised it and made it a whole of 5 cantos, expanded its scope to make it a mock epic, and made it an entire satire on the lives of the 18th century aristocratic society in England, as also a satire on women. So its final version came out in 1715. Then comes Pope's Windsor Forest, which he wrote in 1713. Pope was also a regular contributor to The Guardian, which was a periodical published by Richard Steele, and Pope contributed numerous short pieces to various editions of The Guardian. Then, of course, his translation of Homer's Iliad, a work that he undertook for a whole of 5 years, from 1715 to 1720. This was followed by a long poem, Eloisa to Abelard, in 1717. Then came his translation of Homer's Odyssey from 1725 to 1726. Then his magnum opus, the Dunciad, first version in 1728, the final version in 1743. His essay on Man, a philosophical treatise, in 1733-34. His imitations of Horace, 1732 to 38. His epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot in 1734, and the memoirs of Martinus Scriblerus in 1741. Pope died in 1744. And we can see that he lived a life that was filled with his works of literature, and something that earned him a living, something that gave him fame and name in the literary world of England. But not just name and fame, it created for him numerous enemies. The reason why I am stressing on the various enemies that Pope made during his life is because his epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, which was amongst, or the second but last of his works, speaks of all these enemies in collectivity and his reactions to their mannerisms towards him. Dear friends, I would now like to lead you to an introduction to the poem that we will be studying in subsequent lectures, Pope's An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. This poem, completed in 1734 and published in 1735, is addressed to Pope's close friend and physician, Dr. John Arbuthnot. Dr. Arbuthnot was a Scottish mathematician, physician, and occasional writer. He is remembered as the close friend of Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, and John Gay, and also as a founding member of their famous Martinus Scriblerus Club, which aimed to ridicule bad literature and false learning. Therefore, not only was Dr. Arbuthnot a man of medicine, but also a man of letters, and in that sense, a perfect friend for Alexander Pope, because he was Pope's doctor and physician, treating him for his frequent bouts of ill health. We've already discussed in our life of Pope that he suffered very frequently from this tuberculosis of the bones called Pott's disease. Arbuthnot, therefore, filled the role of a patient listener, well-wisher, and advisor for Pope. In essence, he was Pope's friend, philosopher, and guide. Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot is an apology written in heroic couplets, which was the salient stanza used in poems in the 18th century. It is a work in which Pope defends his own literary works against the attacks of his detractors, particularly the writers Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who had once upon a time been his friend but then turned an enemy. It is also an attack on Joseph Addison and on John Lord Hervey, one of the members of the English aristocracy. Let me quickly take you through the idea or through the epistle as a literary genre. The epistle is a composition in prose or poetry written in the form of a letter to a particular person or to a group. In literature, there are two basic traditions of verse epistles, and let us look at both. One tradition is derived from the epistles of Horace, the Greek poet. The tradition based on Horace addresses moral and philosophical themes and has been the most popular form since the Renaissance. Well-known examples of the Horatian form of epistles are the letters of Paul the Apostle. Paul was one of the apostles of Jesus Christ. His letters, the Pauline epistles, are incorporated into the Bible. For example, the epistles to the Hebrews, the Galatians, the Philippians, and the Ephesians, etc. And these epistles greatly aided the growth of Christianity into a world religion. Other examples of Horatian epistles would be the works of Alexander Pope, like the one in question, an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Other writers who have used this form of the Horatian epistle include Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's contemporary, John Dryden, and William Congreve, as well as in recent times, in the 20th century, W.H. Auden and Louis MacNeice. The other tradition of epistle writing comes from Ovid's Epistulae Heroidum, better known as the Heroids. And this tradition deals with romantic and sentimental subjects. It was more popular than the Horatian form during the European Middle Ages. And this poem, Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, is written in the imitation of the Roman poet Horace. This poem satirizes cowardly critics, hypocritical pedants, insipid patrons of the arts, and corrupt flatterers and sycophants. It also caricatures Pope's contemporaries. More on the poem in subsequent lectures as we go into detail. For today, that's all. Thank you.